As I returned home from shopping with Tom, my eyes widened in disbelief at the sight before me. A moving truck was parked right in front of our house, and there, under the clear afternoon sky, were my in-laws. My father-in-law, a stern man in his early 70s, and my mother-in-law, always with a commanding presence, were directing movers with swift, sharp gestures. Confusion gripped me as my mother-in-law caught my gaze and frowned slightly, then resumed giving orders to the movers. "Susan, what are you doing standing there?" "Open the door," my father-in-law barked, reaching out towards my purse as if to grab the keys himself. In a reflex, I clutched my bag closer and stepped back, my heart racing. This sudden intrusion, their unannounced arrival, it was overwhelming. "Why are you here? What's happening?" I managed to stammer out, my voice barely above a whisper. With a sinister laugh that sent chills down my spine, my mother-in-law turned to face me fully. "Oh, you don't need to know just yet. Just open the door, will you?" Her tone was light, but her eyes were cold, calculating. Beside me, Tom, who had been silent up until now, paled considerably. "Mom, what are you talking about? Why are you moving things into our house?" The scene was surreal, the quiet street now a stage for this unexpected family drama. As I stood there, rooted to the spot, I knew it was time to clear the confusion, to assert my own stance in this unfolding scenario. "My name is Christy Grubb, not Susan," I started, my voice steady, despite the trembling I felt inside. "I am 48 years old and run an insurance agency, a business I took over from my father. It's important for me to maintain order, both in my personal and professional life." I glanced at Tom, who looked back at me with a mixture of confusion and support. "We met at a work event," I continued, addressing my in-laws directly now. "Tom was introduced to me by a longtime friend of my father. We connected over coffee, found comfort in each other's company after his recent breakup, and things moved swiftly from there." I paused, gauging their reactions. It wasn't long before we were serious about each other. My mother was ill at the time, and I wanted her to see me married. That might have hastened things, but Tom proposed willingly, respecting my wishes as we planned a small wedding attended only by family. With each word, I hoped to bridge the gap of misunderstanding, to weave into this unexpected confrontation a reminder of the love and respect that formed the foundation of my relationship with Tom. The truck, the movers, the unexplained arrival, it all needed to make sense, but first, I needed to assert who I was amidst the chaos. Knowing I was alone, the sudden appearance of my in-laws at our doorstep that day filled me with a mix of trepidation and annoyance. There was no prior call, no message, just the unexpected sound of the doorbell and their familiar faces peering through the glass side panel next to the front door. My heart sank. Tom was out, and I had to handle this intrusion by myself. As I opened the door, their expressions were unreadable. My mother-in-law, with a tight smile, stepped forward. "Christy, dear, we were just in the neighborhood and thought we'd stop by." "It's been too long," she said, her voice laced with an unspoken accusation of neglect. I managed a polite nod, not stepping aside to invite them in, which clearly caught them off guard. "Yes, it has been a while," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "Tom isn't home right now. Can I help you with something?" My father-in-law, who had been quietly observing the exchange, finally spoke up. "We just wanted to see how you both were doing. It's important for family to stay in touch, don't you think?" His voice had a hint of reproach, but also a weariness that I hadn't noticed before. I sighed internally. This was not how I wanted to spend my afternoon, yet here I was, confronted with the past I had tried so hard to keep at a safe distance. "Of course, family is important," I acknowledged, "but as you know, Tom and I value our privacy. We appreciate if visits are planned in advance." They seemed taken aback by my firm stance, yet my mother-in-law's next words cut through the awkward pause. "We understand, dear, but we're family. Surely, we don't need formal invitations between us?" The simplicity of her statement conflicted with the years of tension that had built up. Memories of past grievances, like the conversation about children and their abrupt judgments, flooded back, tightening my chest. I appreciate that sentiment, I continued, but respect goes both ways. We've set boundaries for a reason. I held my ground, despite the fluttering of anxiety in my stomach. As the conversation dwindled, it became clear that they weren't going to push their way in as they might have in the past. Perhaps they sensed my resolve, or maybe the years had softened them as well. "All right, Christy. We won't stay long today," my father-in-law conceded with a sigh, his eyes meeting mine with a glint of understanding, or was it resignation? "We just wanted to reconnect. Perhaps another time, when Tom is here." I nodded, feeling a mix of relief and unresolved tension. "That would be better. Let's plan for a proper visit next time." With a brief exchange of farewells, they turned and walked back to their car. As I closed the door behind them, the silence of the house enveloped me. I leaned against the door, my thoughts racing. The encounter had been surprisingly civil, but the emotions it stirred were a stark reminder of the complex web of family dynamics I was still entangled in. The tension in the room was palpable as Tom's grasp tightened on Susan's arm, his face contorted with anger. "I've had enough of your disrespect," Tom hissed, his voice low and menacing as he ushered his mother toward the door. Mike followed closely behind, his protests adding to the cacophony of raised voices and heated emotions. As I stood by, watching this family drama unfold, my heart raced with a mix of anxiety and a desperate need for it to end. This was not the first time we had clashed with Mike and Susan, but it was certainly the most confrontational. Their unannounced visit, coupled with their intrusive and judgmental behavior, had finally pushed Tom beyond his limit. "Susan, Mike, you need to leave now. We will not tolerate this any longer," I said, finding my voice as I moved to stand by Tom's side. My statement seemed to fuel their indignation. "How can you treat us like this? We're your parents," Susan exclaimed, her voice cracking with emotion as she tried to wriggle free from Tom's firm grip. "And you should act like it," Tom retorted sharply. "Respecting our home and our decisions is basic. You've crossed the line today." With a final push, Tom opened the front door and almost physically shoved his parents out. The door slammed shut with a resounding thud, sealing them outside and leaving a ringing silence in the house. Mike's muffled voice could still be heard from the other side. "You'll regret this, Tom. This isn't over." But Tom didn't flinch, his jaw set, his decision made. Turning back to face me and then to my father, who had witnessed the entire ordeal, Tom's expression softened slightly. "I'm sorry you had to see that," he said to both of us. My dad, ever the peacemaker, simply nodded, his earlier vague smile replaced by a look of concern. "It's not your fault, son," my dad reassured him, placing a comforting hand on Tom's shoulder. "You did what you had to do." We all stood in the living room, the aftermath of the confrontation settling around us like dust. I felt a profound sense of relief mixed with sorrow. Family ties, especially those strained by years of unresolved tensions and differences, can be incredibly painful to navigate. "Let's sit down and calm ourselves," I suggested, motioning towards the couch. "We need to think about how we'll handle things moving forward." As we settled down, the weight of the moment began to sink in. This was a significant turning point. Tom had made it clear that our immediate family, him, me, and my father, was his priority, and he would protect that at any cost. "Thank you, Tom," I said softly, squeezing his hand. "For standing up for us." Tom looked at me, his eyes reflecting a mix of emotions, anger, love, resolve. "I'll always stand up for our family, Christy. Always." And with that, we began to discuss our next steps, knowing that the road ahead might be challenging, but necessary to preserve the sanctity and peace of our home. At Susan's accusation, a mixture of incredulity and irritation washed over Tom's face. "No, Susan. This is indeed Christy's house," he reiterated with a firm voice. "And no, she's not blackmailing me. I'm here because this is our home, Christy's and mine. We've built our lives together, respecting each other's space and decisions." I stood there, still gripping my bag tightly, watching the scene unfold with a growing sense of resolve. Susan's attempt to undermine our relationship and her continuous intrusion were exhausting. Her look of confusion and accusation made it clear she was grasping at straws, trying to regain some control over the situation. And to clarify, Christy isn't just a housewife, Tom continued, his voice rising slightly in defense. She runs a successful insurance agency, a business she inherited from her father and has grown significantly. She's a professional who manages both her career and this home with impeccable skill. Susan's eyes flickered with surprise, perhaps finally beginning to understand the depth of misinformation or assumptions she had held about me. Meanwhile, Mike, who had been a silent observer up until now, chimed in, trying to smooth things over. Let's not argue about this now. We just came because. But Tom cut him off, his patience clearly wearing thin. No, Dad. Enough is enough. We've been through this conversation too many times. You both need to respect our boundaries. We've made it clear that unannounced visits are not acceptable. As Tom spoke, I could see the strain of the moment on his face. This confrontation, although necessary, was taking its toll on him. He was fighting for our privacy and autonomy, values deeply important to both of us. Susan, still not quite willing to back down but visibly shaken by Tom's assertions, muttered something under her breath before addressing me directly. Christy, you should have told us more about your life. We wouldn't have. I interrupted her, feeling a surge of empowerment. Susan, knowing about my professional life or personal achievements doesn't give you the right to impose on our privacy. This is our home, and we deserve respect. The atmosphere was tense, with each of us holding our ground. Susan and Mike seemed to realize that their usual tactics wouldn't work this time. The reality that Tom and I were united and firm in our stance was sinking in. With a heavy sigh, Tom took a step towards the door, opening it once again. I think it's best if you leave now. We need some space and time to think about how we want to handle future interactions. Reluctantly, Susan and Mike moved towards the door, their expressions a mix of frustration and resignation. As they left, the air in the room seemed to lighten slightly, the weight of their presence dissipating with their exit. Turning back to Tom, I reached out and took his hand, squeezing it gently. Thank you, I whispered, my voice filled with gratitude and love. For standing up for us, for our home. Tom nodded, a weary smile crossing his face as he wrapped his arm around me. Always, Christy. We're in this together. As the door closed behind Susan and Mike, we both knew that while today's battle might be over, the war for respect and boundaries with his parents might continue. However, standing there together, it was clear that whatever challenges we would face them united. As Susan's accusations rang through the air, calling me a defective product, a wave of indignation swept over me. The crassness of her words was shocking, yet it revealed the depth of her disdain and misunderstanding. Her attempt to belittle and dehumanize me based on something as personal as fertility was not just offensive, it was cruel. Tom's grip tightened around me, his body rigid with anger. Mom, that's enough, he roared, his voice echoing in the suddenly too small living room. Christy is my wife, and your words are not only inappropriate but deeply hurtful. It's none of your business. The room fell silent for a moment, the tension palpable. Mike, standing a bit behind Susan, looked equally stunned by his wife's outburst, his face registering a mix of embarrassment and disbelief. He seemed at a loss for words, unsure how to navigate the volatile atmosphere Susan had created. Look, I began, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside. Tom and I have always been open and honest with each other about everything, including our challenges with fertility. The fact that this doesn't fit your narrative or your desires for grandchildren doesn't give you the right to insult us. Susan's face turned a shade paler, perhaps realizing she had crossed a line that could not be easily uncrossed. Her attempt to sow discord between Tom and me had backfired, showcasing her desperation and lack of respect for our choices. And to clarify, Tom continued, his voice cold and unyielding, the unknown man Susan mentioned was a client from Christy's agency. She was conducting business, something she does exceptionally well. This is her career, her livelihood, and I support her fully. The air seemed to thicken with each word, the weight of our united front pressing down. It was clear that Susan's visions and our reality were worlds apart. Tom's support in the face of his mother's cruel intentions meant more to me than I could express, reinforcing our bond and shared values. "I've told you before, and I'll tell you again," Tom said, shifting his gaze between his parents. "Christy is not just my wife, she is my partner, in every aspect of the word. What we decide as a couple is our business, and not open for debate or manipulation." Mike finally spoke up, his voice hesitant. "Susan, maybe we should go. We've obviously upset them, and this isn't how we should be handling things." His attempt to mediate was feeble, but welcomed in the storm of emotions. As they prepared to leave, with Mike coaxing a silent Susan towards the door, I felt a mix of relief and sorrow. The confrontation had drawn clear lines and, perhaps, had also marked a turning point in our relationship with Tom's parents. Once the door closed behind them, the relief was palpable. Tom turned to me, his eyes softening as he took my hands in his. "I meant every word, Christy. I'm here, we're in this together, no matter what comes." I nodded, feeling the strength of our bond, solidified even more by the day's trials. "I know, Tom. And I couldn't imagine going through this with anyone but you." As we stood there, united in our living room, the place where we had faced down so much together, I knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them as a team, stronger and more united than ever. As my father-in-law lunged forward, his face contorted in anger, Tom deftly stepped aside, avoiding his grasp. The room was charged with tension, the air thick with the bitter stench of revelations and accusations. Mike's attempt at aggression fell flat, his movements clumsy and uncoordinated in his emotional state. Tom's calm demeanor only served to infuriate him more, but Tom remained composed, an island of calm in the stormy seas of familial discord. "You can't seriously expect me to support you after everything that's come out today," Tom said, his voice firm and unwavering. "I've been self-sufficient since I was a teenager, while you spent my earnings from my part-time jobs. The only responsibility I have now is to my wife and myself." Mike's face was a mask of shock and anger, his features twisted as he tried to process Tom's words. Beside him, Susan was similarly shaken, her earlier bravado having evaporated. The reality of their son's independence and their own misdeeds seemed to finally be sinking in. "You were using my hard-earned money while pretending to struggle financially? All these years?" Tom's voice grew louder, his tone tinged with a mix of disbelief and resentment. "How can you say you deserve support now?" Susan's attempt to interject was cut short by Mike, who seemed to be grappling with his own turmoil. "This isn't what we raised you to be," he muttered, seemingly to himself, struggling to reconcile the son he thought he knew with the man standing before him. Tom shook his head, the patience he had maintained starting to wane. "Raised me? You call stealing my earnings and lying about our family's history raising me? You two haven't supported me in any real sense since I was a teenager. Why should I be obligated to support you now?" In the midst of this heated exchange, I noticed the movers quietly continuing their work, methodically relocating our belongings to the storage unit as previously instructed. The extra charge for their services seemed a small price to pay to avoid further confrontation and to put physical distance between us and the chaos that had erupted. As the movers worked, I made my way to Tom's side, placing a supportive hand on his shoulder. "Let's focus on what we need to do next," I whispered, trying to draw his attention away from his parents' dramatic outburst. "We have each other, and that's what matters." Tom nodded, taking a deep breath as he turned to face me, his expression softening. "You're right, Christy. Let's get our things moved and start fresh. We can't let them drag us down with their issues." With that, we directed our focus back to coordinating with the moving company, ensuring that all our possessions were accounted for. Meanwhile, Susan and Mike were left to absorb the weight of the day's revelations, their loud bickering fading into the background as we planned our next steps, determined to build a future on our terms, free from the turmoil that had defined this day. As Susan's phone conversation devolved into frantic pleas, Tom's previously forced smile evolved into genuine amusement. He shook his head slightly, watching his mother's facade crumble in real time. All these years, he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else, and it all comes out over a phone call. I stood beside Tom, my own emotions a tangled web of disbelief and pity. Pity for the woman who had just exposed herself so thoroughly, for the desperation that clung to her words like a thick fog. The sharp slap that Mike had delivered was shocking, yes, but Susan's retort revealed a depth of manipulation and cold calculation that was even more chilling. "It's been quite a show," Tom said, his voice low. His eyes never left his mother, who was now pacing back and forth, her earlier composed demeanor shattered by the revelations and the sudden exposure of her double life. Mike stood frozen, his anger momentarily subsided as he processed his wife's betrayal. The money, the lies, the manipulation, it was all laid bare in the harsh light of the afternoon sun that streamed through the open windows. "You said you were using the money for the house, for family expenses," Mike said, his voice breaking. "All this time, it was for him?" Susan stopped her pacing, turning to face her husband with a sneer. "Of course, it was. And why not? He gave me what you never could, attention, admiration, and the kind of life I deserved." The raw, ugly truth of her words seemed to suck the air from the room. I could feel Tom tense, beside me, his disgust palpable. Yet, there was also an undeniable release, a sense of vindication in seeing the truth come to light after all these years of suspicion and strife. "And now," Tom added, his voice rising a bit, "you know. All the money I sent, hoping it would help, was just fueling your escapades, Mom. It's ironic, isn't it? You tried to paint me as the villain, as someone who needed to be controlled and managed, when all along, it was you who needed watching." Susan's face contorted with rage at Tom's words. "You think you're so clever, don't you? Just because you've uncovered a little dirt," she spat. But her voice lacked its earlier confidence, her insults ringing hollow in the face of her exposed deceit. "That's enough," Mike said, finally finding his voice. His eyes were sad, defeated. "I don't even know who you are anymore, Susan." As the reality of their fractured relationship hung heavy in the air, I could only offer a supportive squeeze of Tom's hand. We had come here today expecting a confrontation, but the depth of deceit and the resulting fallout were more dramatic and painful than either of us had anticipated. Tom looked down at me, his expression softening. "Let's go, Christy. We've seen enough. There's nothing left for us here." As we turned to leave, Susan's voice cracked behind us, still pleading into the phone, still trying to salvage what little she could from the wreckage of her carefully constructed lies. But for Tom and me, it was over. We stepped out into the light, leaving the darkness behind, ready to face a future unburdened by the shadows of deceit. Susan's face, usually so composed and manipulative, now displayed a mix of shock and indignation as she processed my words. She had never expected me to confront her so directly, or to dismiss her suggestions with such finality. It was clear she was unaccustomed to being on the receiving end of such straightforward criticism, especially from me. "You can't be serious, Christy," Susan stammered, trying to regain her composure. "After all, living together could be beneficial for all of us. Think about the savings, the practicality." I shook my head, feeling a mix of disgust and anger. "Beneficial? Susan, you've just been exposed for manipulating and cheating, not just on your husband but on your entire family. And now you expect us to live together, as if nothing happened? As if we could ever trust you?" Tom, who had been quietly observing the exchange, now stepped closer, his expression hard. "Mom, you need to listen to Christy. We're not going to pretend everything is fine and live like one big happy family. What you've done, it's unforgivable. And trying to manipulate Christy now? It's just too much." Susan's eyes darted between Tom and me, perhaps looking for any sign of weakness or hesitation. But there was none. Our united front was clear, and her usual tactics were failing her miserably. "And as for the alimony," I continued, my voice firm, "that's your responsibility. You made those choices, you managed the finances deceitfully. You can't expect anyone else to clean up your mess." Mike, now slowly picking himself up from the ground, looked between us, his expression a blend of embarrassment and realization. He seemed to be coming to terms with the extent of Susan's deceit and the impact it had on his relationship with his son. I need some time to think about all of this, Mike muttered, avoiding eye contact. It was clear the day's revelations had shaken him deeply. Susan, now realizing her usual strategies were ineffective, let out a heavy sigh. Fine. I see your point. I'll handle my own problems, she said reluctantly, her tone bitter. As Tom and I watched her retreat, we knew that while this confrontation might be over, the repercussions would resonate for a long time. We turned to each other, the weight of the day pressing down on us. We did the right thing, Christy, Tom said after a moment, his voice low. It was tough, but necessary. I nodded, feeling the truth of his words. Yes, it was. And whatever comes next, we'll face it together. As we walked away, leaving Susan to her thoughts and Mike to his newfound realizations, I felt a sense of closure. The air around us seemed clearer, lighter. The future was uncertain, but one thing was sure, we had each other, and we were ready to move forward, together. As I swung open the door, the bright smile of my business associate greeted me. Behind them, nestled comfortably in a plush carrier, was Maureen, the cat. Their deep blue eyes peeked curiously at their new surroundings, their gaze as calm and expansive as the ocean itself. Here she is, my associate said, stepping inside and setting down the carrier, gently. I think you're going to love having Maureen around. She's very serene. As we opened the carrier, Maureen cautiously stepped out, her movements graceful and measured. She immediately began exploring her new home, her tail held high with a gentle flick at the tip. Tom came down the stairs, his steps quickening as he caught sight of our new family member. She's beautiful, he remarked, his voice filled with genuine warmth. He crouched down to Maureen's level, extending a hand. She sniffed it tentatively, then, seemingly satisfied, nuzzled against him. I thought she'd make a wonderful addition to our home, I explained, watching the two of them interact. Especially after everything that's happened. It's nice to focus on something positive, something new. Tom nodded, his attention still on Maureen as she began to purr loudly, her contentment filling the room. It's perfect, Christy. It feels like she's already part of the family. As we watched Maureen explore her new home, climbing cautiously onto the sofa and then finding her way to the windowsill, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. The drama with Susan and Mike felt like a distant memory, and though the fallout had been intense, it felt as if we were finally moving past it, turning a new leaf. Our home feels complete now, I said, smiling at Tom. It's just us and Maureen. No more chaos, no more unexpected drama. Tom laughed, his eyes following Maureen as she discovered her reflection in a mirror. Yes, it's just us and our little sea-eyed explorer. I think we're going to be very happy here. The simplicity of the moment, the quiet joy of it, was a balm to the complexities of the past few months. As Maureen settled into a sunlit patch on the carpet, curling into a ball, Tom and I sat down beside her, watching her drift into sleep. It's a new beginning for us, I murmured, leaning against Tom. He nodded, wrapping an arm around me. A much happier one, he agreed. In the calm of our living room, with the soft purring of our new cat as a soundtrack, I felt hopeful about the future. Maureen, with her sea blue eyes, wasn't just a pet, she was a symbol of our resilience, our capacity to start anew, no matter the storms we'd weathered. As the sun set outside, casting long shadows across the room, I knew that whatever challenges might come our way, we would face them together, as a family.